like to welcome you all to the latest in our Peter Kirstein Lectures, and I'd like in particular to welcome Peter's family here, Peter's wife Gwen, daughters Claire and Lynn, and the rest of the family as well. So you're very welcome. When Peter was alive, Peter, for those that don't know, was the founding head of department of computer science. And Peter was, how shall I put it, a disruptive influence. He didn't accept the world as it was, he sought to change it. So the Peter Kirstein Lectures are intentionally lectures where we look for challenge, we look for debate, we look for discussion, things that are going to expand their minds. This year we have Cory, Doctorow, and I'm going to hand over to Igor in a minute to introduce him. But I want to pay tribute, actually, to the organising panel here. So when Peter was alive, he and I had a discussion about what the shape of these lectures should be. And one of the things that we decided was that they should be organised each year by people who were new or relatively new to the department. To keep them fresh, to keep them with that level of challenge. And so I'd like to pay tribute to Leonie Tanzer, Igor Gapanov, Alex Lee, and a really particular thank you to Vajir Farouk, who's kept us on track. Okay, in terms of housekeeping, we're not expecting fire alarms. If there is a fire alarm, then there's a fire. We need to leave. So there are emergency exits around. Please follow people through them. What we're going to do is I'm going to hand over to Igor briefly. And then we're going to hear from Cory, and then we're going to run a panel after that. If you want to post questions on Slido, you can. We will come round with microphones as well later on. But there is a QR code, and there are QR codes dotted around. So if you want to put them online, you can do that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Igor to introduce Cory.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, so I guess most of you who are here know Cory already, but just a short introduction. Cory Doctorow is a blogger, digital rights activist, writer, sci-fi writer, and on top of being an award winner, he's also known for a big proponent for being a big proponent, for example, for Creative Commons license and being a big activist, right? Talking about digital rights and big companies abusing them very often. So this is what I believe the talk will be about today. And without any further ado, let's welcome Cory Doctorow.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to grab this podium here. Let's see how we get on. There we go. Whoop. I'm my own roadie here. Hi, thank you very much. What an honor to give the Kirstein Lecture and to be here at UCL and to be speaking to all of you. I'm very, very pleased. Now, I have a confession to make, which is that I am now old. I'm in my 50s. I've been doing tech policy for a couple of decades now. I have 2 artificial hips. As soon as I can stop writing books and stay home for a while, I'm getting 2 cataracts removed. I have 20/20 vision when that's done. I'll have no more glasses for the first time since I was like 9 years old. And when you get old, you are issued a license to describe everything as having gone downhill. But I do think that things have gone downhill. I want to say that a couple of decades ago, before the internet was, as Tom Eastman says, 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, that it was a better internet. And I think that the phenomenon that drove the internet to look the way it does, to be the unsatisfying and disappointing place that it has become in the intervening years, I don't think it's a mysterious phenomenon. I actually think that it is endemic to the economics of platforms. And I think that platforms are the businesses that are endemic to the internet. Intermediaries that serve buyers and sellers, sit between them, giving services to each of them. And that unchecked by regulation or competition, platforms gradually gather up more value for themselves until things get worse and worse and worse. So the way that that works is platforms begin by allocating surpluses, by giving goodies to end users to bring them in until they find some way to lock those users into their platform. And then they start to withdraw some of those surpluses, some of those goodies, and they hand them to business customers. Maybe they're Uber drivers, maybe they're Amazon sellers, maybe they're writers on the Kindle platform. They draw those business customers in too, giving them quite a good deal. Once they're locked in, they withdraw the surplus from them as well, and they hand all of the surpluses that remain to their own shareholders, leaving just enough value in the system to keep both of those groups locked in. And I have a technical term I've coined for this, one that's certainly done a good business since I came up with it a few months ago. I call this enshittification. And enshittification is indeed why the internet is worse now than it was before. So I'm here to give you a talk, and this talk is a talk for people who want to destroy big tech. It's not a talk for people who want to tame big tech. I don't think we can or should fix it. And it's not a talk for people who want to get rid of technology itself. I don't think technology is the problem. I think we spend way too much time thinking about what the technology does and not nearly enough time thinking about who it does it for and who it does it to. So I want to give you a talk today about the thing that big tech fears the most. Technology operated by and for the people who use it and depend on it, that is designed to resist enshittification. So let me give you a little enshittification case study. Facebook is a really good case study in how enshittification works. So when Facebook started, it was obviously just for American college kids and then subsequently kids with in the K-12 program. So this is elementary to secondary students. So you had to have either a .edu or a .k12 email address to get onto Facebook. But around 2006, they decided to open it up to the rest of us. They had a problem, which is that everybody who was interested in social media already had an account on a service called MySpace. And so they had to convince all those MySpace users to stop using MySpace and start using Facebook. And they made this pitch. They said, MySpace is owned by an evil Australian billionaire who spies on you with every hour that God sends. Facebook is the service that will never spy on you. Come use Facebook. We're the non-surveilling way to talk to your friends. They had a great value proposition beyond not spying on people. It was this: if you would come to Facebook and tell Facebook who mattered to you among the other Facebook users, enumerate your social graph, tell Facebook who you wanted to hear from, then every time those people posted something that they wanted the people who followed them to see, Facebook would show it to you. So come to Facebook, we won't spy on you, we'll show you the things that you want to see. Now, when people flock to a social media service, they do their own lock-in. The service actually doesn't have to do much to lock them in. People get locked in by something called the collective action problem. This is something you're going to experience on your own if you come here with a few friends and then afterwards you want to go to the pub, because you're going to have to decide which pub you're going to go to, right? And you're going to have to decide what time you're going to leave. And you're going to have to decide, if you decide to get a pitcher of beer, what flavor of beer to get, right? This is the collective action problem. It's very hard to solve. It's one of the hardest problems to solve. It's especially hard to solve when you're talking not about 3 or 4 friends who've come to a presentation together, but rather hundreds of people who've come together on a social media site and are all quite unhappy with that social media site, but can't agree on whether they're unhappy enough to leave, and if they are, where they're going to go, and if they are going to go, and they've decided where they're going to go, when they're going to go there. And so Facebook, once people started to pile in, understood that those people were now locked to the platform, and it could start to deprive them of those surpluses. Whoops, I have somehow managed to put page 2 not after page 1. That's not good. That's interesting because I had all the pages not long ago. All right, I am vamping for a page and a half. Okay, so Facebook then wanted to lure in business customers. And so it went to the business customers and it said, we made some promises to our users. Those promises turned out to be conditional. This is sort of the Darth Vader MBA. I have altered the deal, pray I don't alter it further. So they went to the advertisers and they said, do you remember when we told you we weren't going to spy on our users? we were shading the truth a little. We have now got a fully spun up non-consensual surveillance dossier on those users, and we'll let you use it to target those users with a high degree of fidelity at an extremely low cost, and you're going to be able to reach all of those people. And they went to the media companies and they said, do you remember when we told those users that we were only going to show them the things that they asked to see? That was also a conditional promise. Its time has passed. If you want to post brief excerpts of the things that you put on the real internet, on the web, with a link, we will like non-consensually ram it into the eyeballs of some of our users, and some of them will click the link and they'll create a funnel that drives traffic to your website, which you can monetize, right? You've got a website, you've already figured out how to make money there. We're just going to send users there, and whatever you do to make money is going to work great. And so the advertisers, the publishers, they get locked in too. They start to retool their business around it. And then Facebook withdraws the surplus from them as well. So for advertisers, they just stop policing the ad market as closely as they used to. You get a lot more ad fraud. They charge you for ads that no one sees. And they also raise the price of ads. They got much more expensive. For publishers, they turn the dial so that fewer and fewer people see the stuff that you're posting, and that the factor that determines how far the reach goes is whether you're posting more and more of your content to it. So not just a brief excerpt, but something that constitutes a perfect replacement, so that there's no reason for someone who's seen your thing to leave because they've seen all of it. And eventually the kind of apotheosis of this is they say, if there's a link in the post, we're probably not going to show it to anyone. Right? And so now it's not a funnel. Now you're actually captive within the platform. And then they withdraw the surplus from advertisers and from publishers, right? They say to the publishers, hey, you know how some of those people who we crammed your content into subscribe to you because they quite liked it, they're not going to see it anymore unless you pay to boost your content. Right? So this is enshittification. You have all the surpluses withdrawn from end users, so most of your feed consists of things not that you've asked to see, but that makes Facebook money, which is to say either ads or posts that someone has paid to boost. And there's just enough left to keep you stuck there, just enough left to maintain the collective action problem. Advertisers are paying more, they're reaching fewer people, their ads are less effective, there's more ad fraud. Publishers have their whole audience migrated to Facebook. They rarely see their stuff unless they pay to boost them, but they've gotten out of the habit of going to the web. Meanwhile, other services like Google have drawn down RSS readers and so on. So it's much harder to reach people on the open internet more generally. And so at this point, Facebook can really put the screws to everyone, withdraw surpluses, and start giving things to themselves. But this is a very brittle equilibrium, right? When you take away everything that makes the service valuable, except for just enough so that people don't leave, you perforce make those people balanced on the knife edge of being so close to leaving that maybe they'll leave if one scandal hits. So if there's a huge Cambridge Analytica style privacy scandal, if there's a live stream mass shooting, if there's a whistleblower, all of a sudden people can get so fed up that they start to go. They can go almost instantaneously from I can't imagine living without this service to I can't imagine why I'm still using this service. And then people flee. And when that happens, the services do a thing that tech bros call pivoting. In the rest of the world, we would call it thrashing. And so in the case of Facebook, that's this overnight decision that as the value of Facebook has sort of reached its bottom and shows no sign of even having a dead cat bounce, we should, all of us, become prepared to spend the rest of our days as legless, sexless, low-polygon cartoon characters in a virtual world named after an idea from a satirical 25-year-old science fiction novel. That is the enshittification cycle in a nutshell. And you can apply this to Google, you can apply this to Amazon, and so on. I've written a lot about this, and you can go look that up on your own. Now, people who have encountered this hypothesis have asked me whether this is just another word for rent-seeking or for fraud or for wage theft in the case of, say, Uber, and whether it is, in fact, a digital phenomenon at all. But I think this really is endemic to digital platforms in a way that is distinct from the way other platforms go ahead and do bad things to themselves. Because there are platforms in the rest of the world too. Grocery stores are a platform that mediate between food companies and users, and just like Amazon, they compete with their own suppliers and so on. But there are things about digital that are different. So before I get into the differences, I will tell you one of the similarities that digital shares with those offline analog businesses. And the big similarity is a general reduction of competition in every sector. And again, this isn't a mystery, right? It wasn't like the great forces of history came down and bore down on this moment to create a winner-take-all economy in which every sector is dominated by between 1 and 5 firms, which is really true. I mean, whether we're talking about cheerleading or professional wrestling or beer or spirits or international shipping or tennis shoes, really you are looking at sort of 2 to 5 firms. Eyeglasses are one company called Luxottica Essilor. It's a French-Italian tie-up. They make more than 50% of all the lenses in the world. Every high street brand you've ever heard of, Lens Crafters and so on, Sunglass Hut, they all belong to them. If you've bought Dolce & Gabbana or Coach or Oakley or Bausch & Lomb or Oliver Peoples, you've bought a pair of Luxottica Essilor lenses. If you've got eye insurance through iMed, which is the largest insurer in the world, it comes from them. And they've raised the prices of glasses 1,000% in the last decade. So every sector looks like that. It doesn't matter what sector we're talking about. They all look like this. And this comes as a result of a deliberate policy choice taken about 40 years ago in the Reagan-Thatcher era, where we just decided that rather than enforcing competition law with the purpose of making sure that firms are always small enough that we can sort of reach into them and regulate them if need be, and that they never become too big to fail and too big to jail, that we decided that we would let firms get infinitely large, provided that they could show that they were efficient because they were making prices go down. And as you see with Luxottica Essilor, making prices go down can sometimes have a special definition. That means making prices go up. Because making prices go down, in this case, turns out to turn on a very abstruse field of economic modeling. And in order to successfully mount a challenge under this doctrine, you have to prove not just that prices went up, but that prices went up specifically because of market power, which turns out to be a thing that's very, very hard to prove. And so firms that buy all of their competition and then put prices up can then argue that it was an oil shock or a labor shock, or the moon is in Venus, and that's why prices went up, and it just becomes practically impossible to unwind them. And this is a thing that's common across all sectors. And it's definitely true of tech. Our largest tech firms are not firms that grew by being excellent. They're firms that grew by having the faith of the capital markets that allowed them to go on buying sprees. So you look at giant companies like Google. Google is a company that made one very successful product. They made a search engine. They made 2 pretty good derived products. So they made a Hotmail clone called Gmail, and they used some old Safari code to make a browser called Chrome. And then everything else they made in-house failed. Google Video, RSS Reader, and so on. Everything that they made a success out of, they bought from someone else in a merger that would have been prohibited before Ronald Reagan. They want to tell you that they're the Willy Wonka ideas factory. They're just the buying things factory. And this is true of all these other companies as well. Apple buys 90 companies a year. They go shopping for companies more often than you and I go shopping for groceries. And so this is true of tech. Tech bought its way to dominance. We have these small number of firms because they devoured the other ones. But there are 2 things that are specific to tech that are not available to the rest of the platform, of the rest of the firms and the rest of the sectors of the economy. The first is that platforms can twiddle. They can change the business logic very quickly on the back end because it's all just sitting there in the form of code that has control panels where you just turn a knob or move a slider. Prices change, recommendations change. The ability to earn a living as a seller on the platform changes from moment to moment, second to second. So if you're an Uber driver, you sort yourself into one of 2 categories. Either you're an ant who takes every ride that's offered to you, or a picker who cherry picks the best rides. And Uber's wage allocation algorithm seeks out people who don't take rides very often and offers them above the odds payments. But once they start taking rides very often, it moves them back into the standard payment model. So once you become an ant, it stops treating you like a picker. And so if you look at the Uber message boards, they're full of Uber drivers who think that they're bad at Uber because they know people who only drive a few hours for Uber every week and make a lot of money, and they drive all the time and they don't make very much money at all. And they don't understand what it is they're doing wrong with the app. And of course, as is the case with everyone who's been given an advantage through luck or a force they don't understand, the pickers who are doing really well think that they're good at Uber, right? Just like people who inherited a lot of money think that they do harder work than the rest of us, right? They think that they have done something remarkable and that the Uber app has recognized it. Really, it's like all those Londoners you meet who had the incredible business nous to have a place to live in 1970 and now think that they're Warren Buffett because it's worth £2 million and they only paid £30,000 for it, and they're like, well, I'm quite good at property. So these people think that they're quite good at, the workers on the other side of the twiddle can be made to feel like they should alter their behavior in order to go off and do more on the platform. The platform can change the rules very quickly. This is something that historic robber barons would have done if they could have, right? If JP Morgan or Rockefeller had wanted to put a rival business out of trading, right? If they had a ferry line that they wanted to knock out, they couldn't just click a mouse and put a rail line down that competed with it, and then click a mouse again and make it go away once the ferry went out of business. The hard infrastructural questions associated with running a real world's firm means that you can't twiddle the way a digital firm can. So the firms twiddle a lot. And if you want to contrast, say, the twiddling available to two different kinds of firms, I always like to think of two different aspects of Jeff Bezos. So Jeff Bezos is a grocer who owns a grocery chain called Whole Foods. And if Jeff Bezos wants to play games with egg inflation and change the price of eggs from moment to moment, he needs an army of teenagers on roller skates with a pricing gun, right? If he wants to change the prices on the other grocery store he owns, Amazon Fresh, he just types a new number into a box on the back end of the content management system and the price changes. With every shell game, it's the quickness of the hand that deceives the eye. Tech firms can do the same things that robber barons did, but faster and with computers. And a lot of the times when you see things being done faster with computers, it seems like something very different is being done. It's just the same thing being done faster. So that makes them not evil sorcerers who've hacked our dopamine loops. It just makes them the same ordinary mediocrities whose howling lack of ethical center allowed them to command our economy, only they get to do it faster and with computers. So they're not evil geniuses. They're not evil. Their ambitions to world domination are neither novel nor especially grandiose. If you go back and listen to the things that the founders of tech, once was tech giants used to say, the founders of Alta Vista, Sun Microsystems, Commodore, Digital Equipment Company, they sound exactly like the people who run our giant tech firms today. The difference between those people and the people we have today is not whether they quested after dominance, but whether they got it. The people today got it. The reason that the tech industry spent generations churning as new companies and systems supplanted the old ones is that in the old days we enforced competition rules and then we stopped. So as I said, we used to ban firms from buying their competitors, and we used to ban them from creating vertical monopolies. The new crop of leaders have found this durable source of dominance. They're lasting for much longer timescales than most of their predecessors did, but it's not because of their leadership and vision. So I want to say here that the fact that all those old platforms collapsed is okay. It's okay that Sun Microsystems is out of business. It's okay that Silicon Graphics is out of business. It's okay that Cray is out of business. It's okay that Commodore is out of business. It's even okay that the beloved BBC Micro is no longer in production, right? It's okay that these platforms come and go. The focus of our regulation on these platforms that we have today that seems so central to our lives shouldn't be on ensuring that as they stay in this kind of senescent, decrepit phase as long as possible because they've piled up so many users in them. We want to make sure that they become a fit place for those users to stay. It should be on protecting users from their inevitable collapse. So to get the internet back, we need to disenshittify it. We need to give up on the council of despair that says that these guys are evil sorcerers who've hacked our dopamine loops that we can never displace. We need to engage with the material technical forces that drove enshittification, and we need to throw it into reverse. We need to do merger scrutiny, structural separation, and other historic remedies. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure my next page is under there. It is, thank you. I just had this moment where like, what if they're all missing? I printed it at the hotel this morning. They have yellow paper. We need to do the things that we historically did with antitrust, merger scrutiny, structural separation, which is when we tell a platform owner you can own the platform or you can compete on the platform, but not both. We used to do this with rail companies. We used to say you can ship freight for other people or you can be a freight company, but you cannot be a freight company that competes with the people you ship freight for because the temptation to cheat will be infinite. We used to do this with banks. We used to say to banks, you can loan money to firms, or you can own firms that compete with the firms you loan money to, but you can't do both. Because when Barclays Pizzeria and Tony's Pizzeria both have a cash crunch, and Barclays Pizzeria goes to its bank, Barclays, and asks for a loan, and Tony's Pizzeria goes to its bank, Barclays, and asks for a loan, Tony's Pizzeria is going out of business, and Barclays Pizzeria is going to end up serving all the pizza in the country. And so we used to say to banks, own businesses or make loans to businesses, but not both. So we can restore those traditional contours of antitrust. We can say no buying your competitors, no merging with your competitors, no predatory pricing, structural separation, and so on. But we can also constrain twiddling. So we can say there's some privacy laws. From now on, if you want to gather users' data, you have to do so with their consent, and the uses are going to be tightly constrained, and so on. This severely constrains the way that a platform can go ahead and do bad things to you. If you're an Uber driver who's a picker that they want to turn into an ant, their ability to process the data about how you're using the platform will be constrained by your consent. We can pass minimum wage laws for gig workers, which would eliminate a whole ton of the ways that twiddling is used to effectively engage in wage theft, to stop gig workers from ever making the money that they think they're going to make because they're dangled one reward and then they get a different one. We can have other fairness-based rules that keep platforms' fingers off these knobs that they can't stop touching. We can have mandatory interoperability. We can say to the platforms, you have to allow other platforms to connect to you so that if a user wants to leave Facebook, they can quit Facebook without having to say goodbye to the people that they left behind. They can resolve the collective action problem that they're otherwise trapped by, because you can leave Facebook, go to another platform, but continue to send messages to the people on Facebook that you left behind until they're ready to go. And in that world where the point at which you are able to leave Facebook without incurring a high cost is much faster on the enshittification cycle, Facebook will be constrained, right? It'll be constrained by the possibility that users will go because they can go and know that if they go somewhere else, it won't cost them anything. It'll just cost Facebook something. And this is a remedy, I'm pleased to say, that's being pursued in many forums, this interoperability remedy. So we have in the European Union, the Digital Markets Act, which creates a mandate on the largest platforms to stand up APIs, interoperable interfaces, to allow third parties to show up and give users a way to leave the platform without leaving the value that they got out of the platform, which will be a source of discipline to those platforms. Here in the UK, we have a really amazing and brilliantly fit-for-purpose institution to do this. It's the Digital Markets Unit at the Competition and Markets Authority. It's the largest engineering and technical unit at any competition authority in the world. It's been around for many years. It was created by an act of parliament, and there was supposed to be a second act of parliament to give them enforcement powers. That wasn't passed. It turns out that if you change prime ministers every 15 minutes for several years, a bunch of really important legislation dies on the order paper. But there's finally really good legislation in front of Parliament, the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Bill, that will create a suite of broad enforcement powers for the Digital Markets Unit, and those 50-some engineers drawing a salary from HM Treasury will finally be able to do things with these amazing reports they've been writing. So as we think about disenshittifying the platforms, we should keep in mind that while platform-side twiddling is bad, end-user-side twiddling can be quite good. When users twiddle, we get things like ad blocking. Right? It's the largest consumer revolt in human history. 1 in 4 web users installed an ad blocker. We have things like stripping off digital rights management from the media we buy on platforms so that we can leave the platform but keep the media. We see things like jailbreaking devices so we can install software of our own choosing and not the software that the platform would prefer us to use. We see installing alternative app stores and so on. This is the user's twiddling. This is seizing the means of computation, clawing back value from the platform operators. And this has always been a part of technology. If you remember in the early 2000s, Apple was about to capsize because Microsoft had leveraged its dominance of commercial software to make sure that everybody had to use Microsoft Office on Microsoft Windows. All the competitors to Microsoft Office had been hunted to extermination. As they used to say, DOS isn't done until Lotus won't run. As a result, everybody had to use Microsoft Windows as well as Microsoft Office, because although there was Microsoft Office for the Mac, it was the single most cursed piece of software to emerge from Redmond. All you had to do was wave the installation disk near a file and it would become forever corrupt. And so I was a CIO in those days, and when we had an office that was a bunch of Windows machines and a PowerBook for the CEO and a graphics station for the designer, we ended up just giving up on running Mac Office. We would just get them a PC and stick it next to their Mac. And then over time, that became so unwieldy that we just put a big graphics card in the PC and threw out the Mac altogether and got, you know, Adobe and Quark and so on for the Windows machine. Apple recognized that it was facing an existential crisis. And so what they did was they tasked some engineers to reverse engineer the Microsoft Office file formats. And they made a fully interoperable suite of Office products, the iWork suite, which is Pages, Numbers, and Keynote. Many of you probably use these programs every day. And they kept those engineers on the project so that every time Microsoft went and twiddled to change the way those file formats worked, Apple counter-twiddled and made sure that they remained intact. So there was this arms race. And eventually Microsoft sued for peace. They standardized Microsoft Office. So if you've ever used an Office file that ends in X, XLSX, DocX, PPTX, those are the XML standard versions. They're now used by tons and tons of vendors. This is how Google Docs works and how all these other platforms work, because Microsoft just decided that they would no longer fight this. So this is a kind of interoperability that's different from mandated interoperability. This is the guerrilla warfare version of interoperability, adversarial interoperability. It's a mouthful to say. So at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit I work with, we call this competitive compatibility, or COMCOM. And it was COMCOM that created that great foment in technology. It's where we got PC clones from. It's how Google indexed the web. It's how Facebook enclosed the web. And the issue today isn't merely that the platforms twiddle all the time, it's that they hoard the twiddling and they block COMCOM. They block this user-side twiddling. There's this combination of laws, anti-circumvention laws, terms of service, tortious interference claims, cybersecurity laws, patents, and other rules that create a kind of felony contempt of business model where doing any kind of reverse engineering or user-side twiddling that displeases a firm's shareholder becomes illegal. We have a name for this in common parlance. We don't call this blocking user-side twiddling. We just call this IP. IP has come to colloquially mean any law or rule I can invoke to reach beyond the walls of my firm and control the conduct of my competitors, my critics, or my customers in order to make sure that they conduct their affairs in the way that is maximally beneficial to me. And I'll give you an example of this. So Amazon owns an audiobook store called Audible. They didn't build it, they bought it from someone else. It's a monopoly, they control more than 90% of the market. And they have a requirement that every audiobook sold on Audible come with their digital rights management, a kind of encryption that makes sure that you can't take that audiobook out of the Audible app and use it in an app that Amazon has no control over. Which means that every time you spend £1 on an audiobook on Audible, it's £1 you have to forfeit if you break up with Amazon. Now this is absolutely mandatory. A creator, a rights holder, cannot opt out of their DRM regime. You have to sell with DRM if you sell on Audible. And for a creator to provide their customers with the tools to leave Audible is radioactively illegal. So it's prohibited under Section 2 of the European Copyright Directive of 2001, and it's prohibited under Article 1201 of the the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998. And Section 1201 makes it very, very illegal. If I were to provide you with a tool to unlock the audiobook of mine that you got from Amazon and take it to somewhere that's not Amazon, I would commit a jailable felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine for a first offense, even though no copyright infringement took place. And indeed, if you were to merely steal that audiobook, it would be far less offensive under the law than me, the copyright proprietor of that audiobook, giving you a tool to do something perfectly lawful with it. So this is what I mean when I say IP is not copyright as we normally think about it, as a set of bargainable rights that creators take into the marketplace to enhance their income. IP is this thicket of rules that allow firms to control the conduct of their competitors, critics, and customers to enhance their own bottom line. Now, COMCOM, this reverse engineering, guerrilla warfare, scraping, and bot stuff, it's grounded in a foundation of computer science. It's grounded in universality, that we don't know how to make a computer that can only run programs that please the firm that made it. We only know how to make the Turing-complete von Neumann universal computer that can run every program that we know how to write. Every valid program runs on every computer. And what this means is that blocking COMCOM is never a technical matter, it's always a legal matter. Because as a technical matter, we can always find a way to reverse engineer, to use bots, to use scraping, what have you, to bypass these locks and do some user-side twiddling. So it has to be unlawful rather than technically impossible to stop people from doing it. So where this gets really interesting is when you take this COMCOM stuff, this adversarial interoperability, and you merge it with these mandates, these interoperability mandates, like we might soon see from the Competition and Markets Authority, like we're seeing from the Digital Markets Act and the EU. Because when they get together, they produce something more durable and administratable than either one on their own. And here's a real-world example. In 2012, the voters of Massachusetts went to the ballot, and on the ballot paper was a plebiscite question, one that they could directly vote on a law. It's a weird feature of American law. I mean, not so weird, it's how we got Brexit. But it's a thing that Americans do far more often than British people do, where you can get a question on the ballot, and you can go mark the ballot and decide whether it's going to become law. And this was a law that said automotive owners should have the right to choose whoever repairs their car. Right? And this was a thing that was passed with an overwhelming majority, nearly 80%, and an extremely high degree of participation. Usually these ballot initiatives don't get a lot of tick boxes, but it turns out if you ask a Bay Stater, do you want to decide who your mechanic is, the answer is a resounding yes. So the way that the plebiscite question was asked, it required firms that made cars to supply independent mechanics with the information needed to decode the diagnostic messages on the wired network in the car, what's called the CAN bus. And so as soon as this passed the legislature in Massachusetts, the automakers all retooled so that their error messages stopped traveling on the CAN bus and instead traveled through a wireless network that they started installing in new model cars, right? And so they basically voided the rule. And it took 8 years, but Bay Staters organized once again. They went back to the polls in 2020, and they said, for avoidance of doubt, we mean wireless networks too, right? And again, 80% all tick the box. It's now they're contesting it in court. But again, it was this huge commanding majority. But here's the thing. During those 8 years, lots of car owners went to their regular mechanic and had the car put up on the lift and then said, actually, it's a model I can't fix. You're going to have to go to the dealer. And people who made loans to automotive service centers or who invested in them discovered that those loans were a bad deal, that like you can't win if you're betting against big car, and they didn't make those loans anymore. And a lot of mechanics went out of business and either went to work for the big automotive manufacturers or just changed trades, right? So this 8-year delay and now it's 10 years because it's still not the law in Massachusetts, even though it passed the plebiscite in 2020. This delay bought them a lot, right? It got the automakers a lot of advantage. So this is the problems with a mandate. Mandates are hard to enforce, they're brittle, they're hard to administer. The firm holds all the cards. Determining whether they violated the rule knowingly or accidentally is a fact-intensive question that often involves bringing in their engineers and deposing them. Generally speaking, when you talk about these very large firms, the only people who understand the way that they work technically are their own engineers. And so you have to try and get a straight answer out of people who have a vested interest in not giving you one. But imagine if at the same time we had immunized people from liability for making tools that allowed third parties to fix cars without cooperation from the manufacturers. Right? At that point, 3 smart kids from MIT could have just reverse engineered those error codes. They could have made a reference design for a gadget with a bill of materials that cost about $3. They could have had several container loads made up in Guangzhou, fired across the Pacific Ocean to the port of Los Angeles, shipped to Massachusetts. They could have sold one to every auto mechanic in Massachusetts for $100. And because regulating interstate commerce is hard, they would have leaked like crazy into every mechanic shop in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And you would think that just the threat that this could arise would have stayed the hand of the automakers. Because of course, once you've got a foothold in the way that people service their cars, you can start offering them parts, you can start offering them warranties, you can start offering them all that high margin stuff that are at the core of the automotive manufacturer's project to control service. But if it didn't stay their hand, because no one ever lost money betting on against the hubris of tech CEOs, if it didn't stay their hand, well, then you would have had a remedy, right? Then we would have actually had cars that you could get fixed. So we need ComCom to make it possible to administer all these mandates that we're creating. The DMA envisions that Facebook is going to stand up an API that they're going to expose to third parties. But it also envisions that if someone like a next generation Cambridge Analytica finds a defect in one of those APIs and begins to scrape millions or billions of users' data, that they'll shut it down. Well, how do you distinguish between a false positive and a firm that is actually making a good faith effort and that genuinely believes that their users' data is at risk? And if it takes 7 years to answer that question, does it matter if you can distinguish the false positive from the false negative? So if we were instead to say, on the one hand, Facebook is required to stand up this API, but on the other hand, third parties are immunized from liability provided for reverse engineering, scraping, and bots, provided that they don't violate other laws like consumer protection laws, privacy laws, and so on, then on the one hand, you would expect this to stay Facebook's hands, because they don't want to have this unquantifiable risk where all these firms that they're competing with on terms that they understand suddenly become competitors who are spending all of their time finding defects in Facebook's intrusion detection systems to allow users to leave Facebook and continue to contact the people they left behind. Facebook doesn't like unquantifiable risks because they don't like surprising their investors. Because when you surprise investors and you're a listed company, they do what they've done to Facebook the last couple of times they surprised them. The first time they lopped $250 billion off their market cap in one day. Second time that was another 700 million. So it was quite a big haircut, and that haircut was visited preferentially upon the people whose stock portfolios was loaded up with Facebook stock, which is to say Facebook's own top executives. So this is a way in which you align the incentives of the people who ultimately make the call about whether they're going to cheat with not cheating. So we add ComCom to the mix, and we get something that's a bit like two-part epoxy. You get this strong, brittle mandate, and you get this flexible reverse engineering guerrilla warfare stuff. Now, how do we get ComCom? Well, we could have a general immunity, right? We could create a law that says, provided you are engaged in good faith activity, you have a defense against claims, whether they come under patent, copyright, tortious interference, non-disclosure, and so on. We could also just wait for these companies to cheat. These companies are incapable of not cheating. Every time we've created a conduct remedy for a big tech firm that said, thou shalt not, they immediately went out and did it. And they keep getting hit with giant fines, most recently over €1 billion. When they cheat, we have a lot of opportunity in our enforcement mechanisms to decide what we're going to do about that cheating. We can say we're going to hit you with a stalking fine. We can also say we're going to hit you with a conduct remedy. From now on, you have a special master who decides whether or not you can bring a case against a competitor who is reverse engineering, bot scraping, doing ComCom. We will review those claims to make sure that those claims are in fact aimed at defending your users and not at controlling the conduct of your competitors, your critics, and your customers. Or we could do a lot of this through procurement. It's quite ghastly when you think about it that our public institutions go out and spend money on technology that they can't modify, repair, extend all on their own. Public purse is a big purse. And it's very weird that we have cars in government motor pools, we have Google Classroom being bought by local education authorities without getting a guarantee that you can get the car fixed by whoever you want, that you can extend the software with any vendor you choose. I mean, this is a very old principle. President Lincoln, during the Civil War, only bought rifles that had standard tooling and ammunition for like a pretty obvious reason, right? Sorry, boys, war's canceled this week. Our single supplier decided not to make any ammo. Right, so we just need to restore this prudent form of regulation. Now, I'm running out of time here. Oh, there's page 2. I'm running out of time here, but I want to close out by proposing a remedy that is both administratable and is easy to comply with. That doesn't create a set of rules that will make it hard for new firms to enter the market, and that's the idea of an end-to-end rule. The end-to-end rule is the idea that if a platform has two parties who are supposed to be communicating with one another, who join the platform in order to consensually communicate with one another. The platform's obligation is to facilitate the most efficient delivery of messages from willing senders to willing receivers as possible. So if you're on a social media platform and you follow someone when they post updates, the default should be that you see the updates. Yeah, you can opt into an algorithmic feed if you want, but you don't have to. If you are on an e-commerce platform and someone searches for the model number of a product that you sell, your product should be at the top of the list, not buried under 5 screens of sponsored results that aren't responsive to the query. All of this stuff is stuff that makes it much harder for the platforms to twiddle the different parties, the end users and the business customers, in ways that suck them in and then take value away from them. And it's very easy to tell whether there are violations of the end-to-end rule. All you need to do to find out whether or not messages from senders to receivers are being delivered is you send a message and you see if it's delivered to the people who asked to see it. So rather than having surreal debates like they did in the US Congress last year, which was about whether or not Google should be prohibited from sending unsolicited fundraising emails from politicians into the spam folder, which is just a bizarre argument to have, we could have had the much more substantive argument, which is if you fish an email out of the spam folder and mark it as not spam, then shouldn't Google be obliged to never put something from that sender into spam again, which would allow the willing communication between elected representatives and constituents, which is very often dropped into spam folders, from ever showing up there? That is a bona fide political question, and again, it's a very easy one to administer, and it doesn't require that new market entrants do a lot of engineering to comply with it. If you stand up a Mastodon server, if you build a search engine from scratch, if you build a social media service from scratch, or an e-commerce platform from scratch, by default, the way that all the code examples work, the way the standards work, the way that the libraries that you build out of work, is they all start by matching the best match, by delivering reliably. All the enshittification stuff is an overlay that gets built to make it work less. And so we wouldn't be creating a regime in which only the largest firms could afford to comply with the rule, in which we tried to perfect the firms instead of abolishing them. So platform owners, they're not evil. They're not sorcerers. They're just ordinary mediocrities, unconstrained by competition or regulation. Under those conditions, the kinds of abusive monopolies that we see are foreordained. Enshittification is the inevitable consequence of letting companies chase their own well-being while depriving us of the right to defend our own interests. A world where platforms are unconstrained by both competition and regulation, where they can add as many knobs as they want and twiddle them all day long, and where we're legally prohibited from twiddling back, is a world where we are always going to end up being twiddled to death. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cory. That was amazing. So we have a wonderful 5-minute bio break for anyone that needs to go to the bathroom, and then we do a Q&A session with Cory.
Hello, welcome back. Thank you very much for participating in person and as well as online. We got a lot of questions, and you are gaining a lot of supporters, I would say. Okay, so we try to distill the questions and compress them as much as possible. We start first with the online questions. It's going to be a little bit long, so let me provide a little bit context. So the context is that now we have digital technologies, and technologies are evolving very, very quickly, such as digital assets like blockchain, digital ID, digital currencies, and the new technology are unprecedented, right? So the government is being very reactive, not predictive. And so what is the best way we deal with it, especially big techs have a lot of capital to influence policymakers, and if not, they can still pay the big bills. So what is the best way to do it? Shall we do the bottom-up, for example, the bottom-up governance? Thank you very much.
So I don't want to get too deep or really detour into this, but I have to say I don't think we have blockchain and digital currencies. I think we have a bubble about those, but I don't think, I think for a thing to be a digital currency, there needs to be something you can buy with it apart from other digital currencies. So let's say that we have people who would like to make digital currencies rather than actual digital currencies, and make sure that we're grounded in reality and not fantasy. There's a joke from Ireland whose punchline is, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. The decision to allow firms to concentrate into these extremely small number of dominant firms does make it very hard to make good evidence-based policy. Evidence-based policy making is generally an adversarial process in which you expect that the regulator doesn't show up as a kind of prosecutor who interrogates the firms who present evidence, but rather as a kind of referee who sorts between claims among rival firms. And if you have a sector where there's a bunch of firms of relatively similar size, then you can rely on those firms to do the work of the regulator and identify the falsehoods, omissions, and elisions that other firms have made in their own parochial interest, so that all the facts come to light. So if you have hundreds of telcos and the question is, should we have net neutrality, you would expect some of them to show up and say, oh, it's technically impossible to operate an ISP that is neutral, and you would expect other ones to show up and say, we do operate an ISP that's neutral, and you can see our server logs, and it is entirely possible to administer this kind of network. But when there's only 4 or 5 firms in a sector, you end up with this problem that they all end up preaching from the same hymnal. They show up and they say the same thing. And partly that's because there's a form of tacit collusion that emerges from any sector that's that concentrated, because the only way to advance through the ranks in a sector with only 4 or 5 firms is generally to hop to another firm. Because usually once you get to vice president, if you want to become a senior vice president, there's only like 5 of those, and they're not going anywhere. And so when a position opens up somewhere else, you jump from one firm to another. And when you look at the careers of the top executives in highly concentrated sectors, they've generally had long tenures in the upper ranks of every firm in the sector, which means that they are godparents to one another's children, executor of one another's wills, they play on the same six-a-side, they go to the pub together, they're in a trivia team together, right? They just know each other. And so they emerge these sets of common practices and points. And so what happens when we try to make regulation is the government asks what should be done, and then everyone who speaks from a position of authority, who runs a big complicated firm, says the same thing, and everyone who opposes them is like an academic or someone from civil society or someone running something that basically doesn't rise above the level of a hobby. And it's very easy to just disregard all those people and give the firms what they want. So one of the things I think about an interoperability remedy is that it creates a set of balances that head towards an equilibrium where you don't need to answer very deep technical questions about what the conduct of the firm should be, right? What's the best way to eliminate harassment on Facebook? I mean, harassment on Facebook's a real problem, but answering that question is something that we don't have time to answer. By the time we answer it, Facebook won't exist anymore, and meanwhile, lots of people have been harassed in the interim. Rather than making Facebook a place where you're less likely to be harassed, which is a good thing, we should make Facebook into an easier place to leave if you're being harassed, right? By creating these interoperability remedies that let you go but stay in touch with the people that matter to you.
All right, thank you so much, Cory. Let's come back to our audience here. So we allow 3 short questions, so please feel free to...
Do you want to do all 3 and then I can maybe roll up a single answer?
Sure. So
and then we
please
can get right to the
raise
panel.
up your hand.
Hi, thank you very much, Cory. I'm going to be brief. I was wondering how can we reconcile, if it's a problem, this idea of mandating interoperability with innovation in a way, because I'm playing devil's advocate, and some companies might say, oh, but if we mandate interoperability, we don't have any incentive to innovate, because every time we do something new, our competitors benefit from it, and then nothing new and better is going to come off of our whatever labs. And how do you respond to this kind of criticism?
Right, it's a good question. Next question?
I'm interested in the structures, maybe the political structures that make it more likely that the tech companies keep winning these kinds of games about making the things that they don't want illegal. Things like trade rules.
Sure.
That kind. How do we change that? I should perhaps confess that I'm a trade campaigner.
Do you think it's problematic that Instagram is planning to integrate ActivityPub into their main product?
Right, Instagram and ActivityPub. Okay, so the first question is about innovation. I think that it is true that constraining what a firm can do in terms of blocking rivals does slow down the rate at which they can innovate themselves, but it presumes that innovation is the province of incumbents who make for good sort of centralized planners of innovation. So, you know, if you think about, say, the App Store model, right, we have a few dominant firms that, to all intents and purposes, act as like commissars, as central planners, and decide what end users can and can't do. Right? The same law that I referenced that prevents you from reverse engineering Amazon's DRM on Audible also prevents you from reverse engineering the locks that keep you from installing a third-party operating system or app store on your device. And so what this means is that even if you have an end user who wants a product, and even if you have a vendor who wants to supply the product, that this intermediary sitting between them acts as a de facto unelected permanent regulator between them. And so it's true that we hold back the ability of these large firms to realize supernormal returns on their capital investment in innovation. But we open up the opportunity for lots of small firms to make all kinds of new innovations and so on. And you know, large firms are generally not the locus of a lot of innovation. There's this kind of paradox where the more capital you have, the larger you are, the more resources you have, the more internal tension you have, the more there are executives who perceive their rivals as being other executives in the same firm because they're both competing for the same promotion and who spend a lot of time trying to undercut each other. The more you have the innovator's dilemma of being locked into certain lines of business that you don't want to disrupt or that elements within your firm won't disrupt and so on. So I am more comfortable with having a world of smaller firms. And then I would say finally that, you know, in the same way that we once had this question in antitrust where we said, that we answered by saying, we are okay losing out on the efficiencies that you might get from having very large firms because it makes them governable. It makes them neither too big to fail nor too big to jail. And we will sacrifice the efficiencies in exchange for the democratic accountability. It's a trade-off I'm willing to make. I would much rather have a world in which 3 or 4 tech executives don't get to decide which software we get to use, who gets to make it, and how we use it, even if it means that those tech executives greenlight fewer large projects. And then finally, we look at these firms and their innovation sucks. Right? I mean, it's metaverse, it's replacing degrading search with florid paragraphs written by habitual confident liar chatbots. It's you know, designing devices that are even harder to open up and repair. Like the amount of energy that goes into blocking third-party repair in the Apple universe, like if they devoted 1/10 of that to figuring out how to make their products better for the users, it would be you know, an incredible world to live in. So I think the idea that you know, the reason that they dominate is because they're so good at innovation, and because they're so good at innovation, they should be allowed to dominate is such an obvious syllogism that we shouldn't really pay attention to it or take it seriously. So the question about trade deals. So I, for my sins, have been a UN delegate from an NGO. The trade deals are generally very poor, and where they have carve-outs to uphold foundations, those carve-outs tend to be very difficult to invoke. So a recent example of this would be in the WTO agreement, in the TRIPS, which is the IP section of the WTO agreement. It contains this rule that says basically poor countries that would otherwise have no reason to honor your pharmaceutical patents will do so in exchange for the promise that in extremis those patents will be waived so that they can make the drugs that they need to survive. And then the pandemic came up, and countries in the global south were like, great, it's time for us to start making vaccines here. After all, the largest vaccine factories in the world are in the global south. The most effective vaccine manufacturers in the global south. And they never got their waiver, despite it being present in the trade agreement. And you had people just peddling this racist lie that, you know, poor brown people can't make vaccines. And when you actually interrogated it, you got this other, even darker thing that got said, which is that we only have so many vaccine precursors in the world. And if we let poor, highly populous nations make vaccines, there won't be enough precursors left over for rich, low population countries to make the vaccines that we need, which I think was a lot closer to the truth, but pretty disgusting. As to how we reform it, when you think about the history of successful industrialization, it generally relies on countries not honoring international trade agreements until they are in a position to be a net beneficiary of it. America was a pirate nation that refused to honor foreign copyrights and patents, and instead printed pirate editions of foreign books, English books. Dickens had to tour America because he couldn't get paid for his books. He could only get lecture fees. And it wasn't until the US became a net exporter of copyrights that they signed on to multilateral treaties and began to respect other countries' copyrights. China is on the verge of reaching this because it effectively just ignored the TRIPS and dared the rest of the world to stop the flow of shipping containers full of plastic tchotchkes. And the world needed its plastic tchotchkes, and so they didn't have to respect the agreements. And now that they're becoming a net exporter of IP, they're probably going to start demanding enforcement and enforcing domestically. I think that we need to recognize that it was ever thus and it will ever be thus, and that anything that isn't grounded in this idea that it has to be a two-way beneficial arrangement is either going to become a charter for depriving poor countries of the right to self-determination, or is not going to be honored. And then the final question, is it a problem that Instagram is standing up an ActivityPub gateway and that you're going to be able to get Instagram on the Fediverse? This is a somewhat esoteric inside baseball decentralization question, but it's a good one. So the Fediverse, which you may have heard of, this thing that Mastodon is built on, is this open protocol that allows lots of people to run their own servers and connect to one another. It's really cool. And Instagram is going to start sending messages to it and receiving messages from it. I think it's great. I think that it's going to allow people to leave Instagram and stay in touch with the people who matter to them on Instagram. You know, there are old communities in those silos that really matter to the people who are in them, that matter so much that those silos can become really rotten without losing their trade. So we had clients at EFF who were breast cancer previvors. So they tested positive for a gene that meant that it was highly likely that they would get breast cancer in their future. And they, of course, because this is a genetic disorder, they all had mothers, daughters, aunts, grands, and so on, who were dealing with breast cancer or died of breast cancer. It was a very, very important group for them to be in. And one of the founders of this group actually discovered that Facebook had a bug that would allow you to enumerate the full membership of any group, even if you weren't a member of it, so that you could find out who all the people with this disease that could be used adversely against them for health insurance and so on were. And they reported it to Facebook, and Facebook said, effectively, it's not a bug, it's a feature, it's part of our ad tech stack, and we're not fixing it. And despite the outrage, they couldn't leave, because as bad as it was to know that they had been exposed in this ghastly way, losing this locus of support for something that was so central to their lives was worse. And so anything that makes it easier to escape the walled garden, I think, is good. And you know, the worst thing that could possibly happen as a result of this, I think, is that Instagram, which is to say Facebook, which pretends it's called Meta now, would actually lose so many users that it might get better. And people wouldn't leave, because I really think we should just abolish Instagram. But maybe it would prolong its senescence, but it would do so by improving the lives of lots of technology users who are right now in substantial risk because of the callousness and control exerted by those firms. So thank you very much. It's time for the panel.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming back in time and for the questions. I do see that there's lots of questions on Slido, so I will try to integrate them into our panel discussion today. I just want to say, extend again my thank you for everyone for sticking around for the panel discussion, which will be incredibly exciting. And yeah, hopefully we'll cherish today Professor Peter Kirstein's legacy, it was a thought-provoking talk, definitely lots of food for thought, and therefore it's my pleasure to host and introduce the panel that we have today. We have Fran here, Francine Bennett. She's interim director of the Ada Lovelace Institute. She's the co-founder of a big data and machine learning startup, or I think actually multiple ones. She worked on data science support for governments, but also charities, and now heads this independent research institute funded by the Nuffield Foundation, which really has the mission that very much aligns to today's talk to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. Then we have Sylvie Delacroix, Professor Sylvie Delacroix. She's a professor in law and ethics at the University of Birmingham and a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. And perhaps of particular interest for today's discussion and our event, Sylvie was the founding director of the UCL Center for Ethics and Law and has a unique interest on issues around habits and how our infrastructure, such as the data-reliant tools that we discuss today, mold our behavior and also our agency. So thank you very much for being here. Then we have Neil Ross to our left here. Neil is Associate Director for Policy at Tech UK. He regularly works with UK and devolved government ministers, parliamentarians, civil servants, and leads on Tech UK's input, for example, also on the UK Brexit debates. And what is important here is Tech UK is a technology trade association, so you have really the challenging task today to perhaps represent the voice of the industry, perhaps. And yeah, thanks for being here. And last but not least, Emma Wright is a partner at the UK-based law firm Harbottle & Lewis, where she leads on the firm's technology, data, and digital group. And she specializes in technology and telecom clients and has experience in handling internet regulatory matters. So again, very topical and suitable for today's discussion. And before I have my own questions, but I see that there's loads of questions online, which I will pick up, I actually want to open the floor to each panelist to give a 3-minute rebuttal or statement or comments to Cory's talk. Do we want to start with Fran? Yeah.
Okay. Do I have this mic?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm certainly not going to rebut, because I think a lot of what Cory said is very, very aligned with what Ada Lovelace Institute also says. So, as you said, our mission is ensuring that data and AI work for people and society. We are a terribly serious research institute, so we probably wouldn't say disinchitify, I can't pronounce it. But that is kind of what we mean a lot of the time. So we really want to make sure these things work well for people, and often that means saying things need to be broken up, things need to be more regulated, and trying to work with decision makers to make sure those regulations are the right ones and the effective ones. So we try and combine lots of different disciplines to do that, so people who understand the tech, but also who are lawyers, also who actually are very good at bringing voices of the public in as well, because that often gets very missed as well, becomes a conversation between experts or self-declared experts. One thing I was really interested to see was how much interoperability came into your talk. We recently did a big report called Rethinking Data, and one of the key things was we said you can't get anywhere without interoperability of the platforms and systems. Without that, it's very hard to do anything else. So we absolutely would advocate for that as well. The DMA mandate that you mentioned, I understand only applies narrowly to instant messaging.
At first. It's a rollout of several platforms.
So I think we would say we would like that to be very broad. So interoperability in many forms, and I think one of the essential things when getting that to work and when drafting that is going to be making sure it's very sharply drafted. To your point about the cars and the wired and wireless access, there are so many slippery ways to get around these kind of rules if they're not well drafted with an understanding of how the tech and the supply chains and the value chains of it all work. I think loads of the points you made are things that we would say actually in different language, but for very many of the same reasons. So yeah, really interesting. I'm looking forward to more discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to join the chorus. There's no way I'm going to rebut anything that's been said. I've been thinking actually as I was listening, and I think, it triggers all sorts of thoughts. And one of them was, okay, I've always been fascinated by change, right? This is the thing that gets me up in the morning very often. I try to understand, how are we capable of change? And I'm not talking of weather change. I'm talking of how are we capable of keeping an ability to change the norms we live by, right? Now, this can be because sometimes we have the wrong norms because of prejudice or fear, but sometimes we have the wrong norms because big changes happen, natural changes or technological changes. And one of these big technological changes is our ability to convert information systematically into binary format. Now that has meant that sometimes some of our existing norms have become unfit for purpose, and I think here IP is one very good example of a set of rules that's become unfit for purpose. It's not very controversial to say that. But sometimes we also need new norms. And what I find completely fascinating, because yes, I am a lawyer by training, but I'm also a philosopher, and I often ask fresh lawyers who come here for the first day, and sometimes I have non-lawyers too, and I ask them, what do you think law is, you know? And they're like, oh, well, that's what lawyers do. And I'm like, no, you know, if you think this is the most dangerous myth that goes around, is that somehow norms or laws are made by lawyers. They're not. Yeah, norms, laws are made by us, for us. And this is one of those myths I really feel it's my duty to try and shake up. And so an example here in this context is among the new norms we've needed because of technological changes are personal data rights. Yeah, these are very important example of new norms. But do they live up to their potential for change? No, right, not currently. Partly because there's a lack of political will to implement them, but there's also a lack of imagination on the part of lawyers, to actually think. I'm assuming it's only one lawyer next to me. It's just, we actually need tools for collective empowerment, not just individual action, right? And so what I love about the ComCom refrain here is that it's a song, it's a tune I like to sing, is to say, okay, we do need top-down regulation, we do need mandates, yes, but these mandates are not going to live up to their potential unless we have what you call ComCom, what I call bottom-up empowerment infrastructure, effectively. And this bottom-up empowerment infrastructure, I think there's so much to learn from what we've just heard today, Cory. And one of the things that we need to do in universities like this is to equip every single student that goes through a ranks, whether it's in computer science or law or whatever, to understand that they have the means for this ComCom. Yeah? Whether you're a lawyer and you don't get completely scared by, oh, this really complicated technology, or whether you are a computer scientist and you're like, oh, laws, that's for lawyers. No, right? You can't change things, but you do have to commit to this. And the ComCom kind of commitment, I think, is something I really want to amplify, and I hope we can all learn new habits of participation effectively through that.
So I think I come at this from, I have a public policy background. So I worked at the UK Department for Trade in the 1990s, and now obviously I lead a team where I don't act for the FANGs, but I act for tech companies, I act within the entire tech ecosystem, and also for customers who are bringing around about digital transformation. And I'm not actually going to counter anything that Cory said. However, I think, and this is showing my age, I remember a time when I had family in Canada. I really wanted to speak to them, and the phone charges to speak to them cost me an absolute fortune. And there were these companies that they weren't like telcos, which is really my background. But I could communicate with these people, and it was for free. And I think we've reached this inflection point with the tech companies, with the big tech companies, where they've gone from these really cool, innovative companies, and I entirely agree with this innovation point, to the same as any other big business. And I think what we are struggling with, and I absolutely support the new bills that are being proposed, but I do think, with my kind of public policy hat on and my experience of trying to draft some of this legislation, not as a private practice lawyer, but many years ago, that we are constantly playing catch-up. And we were playing catch-up in the 1990s when the Comms Act of 2003 was being thought about. At the time we had a Telco Act 1984, we had some spectrum laws that were really old, we had Computer Misuse Act, and we had a Data Act that nobody really looked at because it was all held in filing systems, really. And so we still have that point, right? And I don't know how, and I think the problem is with any of the legislation that we are trying to create, we will always struggle to stay ahead. And so where does this say? So I agree with Cory, but I do think there was a point where they have brought about tremendous change, and some of it has been beneficial to us. I can't live without Amazon Prime. I'm a mum of two. It has transformed my life. Do I agree with all the practices that Amazon have brought about? No, I don't. But that is my reality, and it's particularly reality during COVID, right? They offered a great deal of benefits. Now, my side gig, when I'm not doing my putting essentially commercial partnerships in place, is that we've created a global network of legislators that are looking at emerging technology. And what we're trying to do is build capacity, because I agree there is a lack of capacity within our regulators and not through one of, any failing on their part, apart from they cannot compete. If you wanted to be involved in data science, you went to a tech company. You didn't go to a regulator. We can't compete financially. And that has built a great deal of time that we want to catch up. We need to catch up. I think that's... I was trying to find something to disagree on. I also agree with the point on the innovation. So just as a bit of a history, I worked at a technology law boutique company called Kemp Little. We were acquired by a Big Four. We were trying to innovate and create tech products to change the nature of how legal professional services were delivered. We were acquired by a Big Four, and we haven't really delivered any of that now. And so I absolutely support you that it's all about as soon as you become into a Big Four or in whatever industry, a lot of the innovation goes as well. Thank you. Last one, please.
Sorry, I might have to lean forward a bit. So my name's Neil Ross. I work for Tech UK. So Tech UK represents about 1,000 tech companies in the UK tech space. So it's any kind of company that's got a major or kind of a big investment in the UK, and it can range from companies that are 4 or 5 people who are based here, right up to many of the companies which Cory was talking about in his lecture. As you would imagine, some of the companies agree with what Cory has said, some definitely don't, and others take kind of more of a middle view. So I think sort of in my opening remarks, I'll try and give you a sense of how the tech sector in particular is approaching these issues, particularly kind of in relation to the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Bill, which me and my colleagues are kind of actively working on with the government, the Labour Party and others as well as it goes through. Ultimately, I think the kind of key question is about how you ensure these digital markets function as well-functioning markets across the space. But the question of how you get there is often very highly contested, depending on who you're talking to in the tech industry. Overall, our members across that 1,000 or so companies fall into basically 3 groups. There are kind of the big 5 we've been talking about who will be regulated by this bill and have very strong feelings about what it means for their business models and how they can operate. You then have effectively their immediate competitors, so the people who are the challenger firms, the ones who have the most to gain from this legislation going through in terms of building their competitive advantage and market share, who are also very, very invested in the bill. And then probably a third group, which is less talked about, which is the kind of wider tech sector, often who will have partnerships or work closely with the big 5 companies because they give them benefits to scale and deploy their products. And while they see lots of benefits from the bill and these interventions around getting access to data, understanding how their products are performing, they're nervous about the implications for some of the partnerships that they might have. You might be, say, for example, an accounting firm or someone else who actually gets a lot of benefit from operating within Microsoft's ecosystem, and then you're concerned about the implications for your company. So that's kind of broadly how the sector itself is thinking about it. There are probably 2 big solutions that this bill is going to present, and they're going to have very different applications. One is one wing of the solutions come in these kind of conduct requirements, which we've talked about, which are basically, how do you address the kind of the consequences of market power? Making sure people have, when they're selecting their internet browser and their phone, more choice over which one it should be, and requiring people to think about what service they're using as systems are designed. And then the third one, which is these kind of pro-competition interventions, get a lot closer to the solution Cory was talking about around interoperability, and they can be much more sort of invasive into how companies work. But that's when you kind of kick the hornet's nest on the different views about what companies think across the sector. So it can all be basically quite complicated. However, we're generally very supportive of the legislation. The framework seems pretty good to us. It's just a question about how you get the right guardrails in place, the right structures for companies to feed into it, and ensure that the CMA and the Digital Markets Unit can take the right decisions. And there's probably three big questions about how we make sure that happens. One is the resourcing of the Digital Markets Unit. So to come back to Emma's point, can they hire the right people with the right skills to understand the systems and processes they're going through? Will they have just enough people to deal with the potential caseload that cross their desk, especially if they start to designate in multiple different areas? The other issue is, what is the kind of accountability on the Digital Markets Unit? The UK is responding to fast-moving digital markets, fast-moving tech issues, by basically putting lots of principles into legislation and giving regulators quite a lot of power to decide the rules of the road afterwards. That's applied in the Digital Markets Bill, but also the Online Safety Bill and the Data Protection Bill as well. So there's a question about how those regulators, which get more power, are being held to account by Parliament or by government or by the people. And then the third part is kind of, what are the mechanisms for companies as well to engage in this? What are the appeals standards they can use? How can they sue each other or defend themselves? Which raises a lot of questions over the impact that will have on firms, questions about whether to invest in the UK, and there's a balance to be struck across a lot of those areas. So I've probably not answered many questions, I've probably just thrown up more that come from out of the industry, but these are the things that we're thinking about anyway.
I don't know, Cory, if you want to respond.
I would say just very briefly that one of the traps to avoid when we talk about regulating these firms is the trap that the way that they operate now is kind of inevitable, and that if we get rid of the parts that we don't like, we'll also get rid of the parts that we like. In fact, one of the things that interoperability really does is it decomposes the pre-feast menu of big tech into an a la carte one, where if you think about ad blocking, you have the publishers making an offer, which is, how about we track you in this really invasive way and we throw up these ads that are really distracting and so on. And the reader gets to say, how about no? And, if you remember, there was this period where we had pop-up ads. And your browser would spawn like 20 new windows. Some of them would be 1 pixel by 1 pixel, and they'd run away from your cursor while playing music and so on. And we didn't have to pass a law to say ad blocking or pop-up ads are too obnoxious to live and you're going to have to stop making them. Instead, browsers just started bundling pop-up blockers that were on by default. And at that point, nobody bothered putting pop-ups in. If you turn off the pop-up blocker built into your browser, you don't get a lot of pop-ups. The pop-up just became extinct because you had user-side twiddling. So, I think that Google would like us to think that the reason that you get spied on when you search is because a prophet came down off a mountain with 2 stone tablets and said, Larry, Sergey, stop rotating your log files and start mining them for actionable market intelligence. But the reality is that Google didn't have any surveillance for its first several years, and in fact rose to dominance without it. And there's no reason to think that we could have that giving up on surveillance from Google would mean giving up on Google. So yeah, I like Amazon too. I like having a single catalog with every SKU of every product that I might want to buy is super handy. And I would love for third parties to be able to take that ASIN database where those SKUs correspond to every good and offer it to local merchants as part of their inventorying system, so that you could run a browser plugin that when you search for something on Amazon would say, hey, this shop down the road has it, buy it with 1 click. So you could treat Amazon as the catalog, commodity catalog for everything in your neighborhood. And then Amazon would have to sell you things by being better, not by being the default. I think that would discipline Amazon. I think we could have efficient delivery without having delivery people peeing in bottles. I can imagine that future, and I think if I can imagine it, we can probably make it. It doesn't seem like making water that isn't wet. Seems like a reasonable goal to go for. And so, yeah, let's decompose and recombine the parts of tech that we like and discard the parts that we don't.
That touches on some of the questions that are online, and I also want to invite everyone to also perhaps raise your hand if you want to ask a question in the room. There were several questions, that's to the whole panel as well. For one, I think we're talking a lot about, and that is reflected in some of the questions, we have kind of general principles and idea of what we should do, but I do still think I want to hone in on the question of how, exactly. I wonder if the panel can comment on that. You mentioned, there's a lot of critique in your forthcoming book around competition and antitrust laws. where have they failed, and how can we just like improve that? So I think like the how question on the whole panel. And the other aspect, there seems to be several questions which I think are quite interesting. Is this a very Western debate we're having? Because most of these companies are US based. We're not talking about many of the corporations that are, in China and other countries. So what about that? What does that mean? I don't know if anyone wants to start and kick off.
Yeah, just one comment about the how, and it's a very important thing about regulators, and I think it gets disregarded because I think you've mentioned the shield of boringness before as being a very important force, and I think this is hidden behind the shield of boringness, which is a lot of things get pushed to regulators to say you have the powers now to regulate, go forth and do it. One thing that's really important to understand is most regulators are very, very small compared to the things they have to regulate, and they are very, very underskilled and underpowered. So I'm an advisor to one of the UK regulators who regulates an enormous industry. They are supposed to regulate with data. They have 2 people who run data and IT. And they, under government rules called DDAT, are allowed to pay, I think it's about £60,000 maximum for technical people. That does not go far in the market to have someone to lead technical systems for an enormous regulator who is trying to work against a very, very big industry. So literally just resourcing regulators with a realistic amount of money and allowing them to pay people enough money to do a good job is super important and is an extremely false economy if you don't do it. And I think it's also a very deceptive practice to say it's fine, the regulators are taking care of it now, they have the powers, without paying attention to those fine details of can they hire the people that they need to do the work. CMA is a big exception in that case, the FCA to some extent as well, but there are a lot of other regulators who just don't have what they need. And we saw the UK AI white paper immediately said, oh, it's fine because we'll move lots of things to regulators without even speaking to many of the regulators about that. So it's a big problem.
Can I add to that, actually? Because this is it just piggybacks on just what you say, because it's like, I really, this refrain of saying, just let's give the problem to the regulators, right? And then without checking whether they're equipped to do so, which is a very important point. But then increasingly, though, I also think we've fallen into a very perverse habit of delegating what actually should be a civic responsibility to regulate. So any tricky problems we find ourselves in, but that's going to be for the regulators, without really considering seriously the extent to which regulation will be much more potent and realize its potential only if we also build this kind of civic participation, if we get rid of this habit of passivity that we've fallen in. We've all become super used to clicking away these consent windows, asking us, do you consent to this? And it's instilled a very insidious habit of passivity when it comes to data governance and other things. And I really believe that there's equally importantly, yes, let's fund the regulators adequately. At the moment, they are not, practice for sure. But also, equally, I think we need to think of how we empower groups, so not just individuals, but groups, to get together and learn new habits of participation effectively.
I would agree with that. I think we're sort of looking at quite a structural question of how do you, basically like digital technologies markets move really, really quickly, far too fast for legislation. That's the broad consensus we've got at the moment. The solution is to delegate powers to regulators to kind of deal with the problems as they go forward. But you've got to make sure that, and in theory that works, on a piece of paper, but you've got to make sure the plumbing of that system works effectively. And that means ensuring that people have participation into how the regulators are designing their things. There's adequate consultation and input from civil society and businesses. The regulators themselves are resourced effectively enough, and the AI white paper is a perfect example of being like, okay, we've asked the ICO, Ofcom and the CMA to take on big new responsibilities for competition, data protection, and online safety. And do AI as well, but without giving them additional resources, which seems really, really difficult. And also likely for the industry means that regulators will get things wrong, and that likely means there'll be a counter-reaction on the other side, which isn't necessarily good for tech companies operating in different fields, who often, and in most cases, want to kind of comply with the rules or have ideas about ethical products they can launch. So we have to build a system that's based on research, ethics, empowering different groups, supported by regulators who are listening and trying to understand, act, engage with technical experts and have technical expertise themselves, but then also have really strong oversight from government and from Parliament who can't move fast enough and won't have the level of technical expertise, but can certainly probe push and demand things of regulators, which everyone else can respond to. So there's a broad system that we have to try to set up over the next few years for all of this stuff to kind of work properly.
And I also might perhaps a comment on the Western focus. Perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for all of you computer scientists here, I would ask you to go forth and demystify technology. So as a lawyer, when a lawyer says, oh, it's really complicated, I get very frustrated because that means they're not speaking to their non-legal kind of business colleagues in a way that's easily digestible. And I would say this, and I'm often, because I run a team of 7 female technology lawyers, or 1 guy. I'm often told by men, technology experts, it's very complicated, you won't understand. Actually tell me, please, because I have spent time doing, I understand this. And I'm amazed. I'm currently trying to put something together where we're dealing with a marketplace. And the company I'm representing is incredibly large in its area of focus. And the amount of times we're being told the algorithm's really complicated, you won't understand. Now, some of that will be hiding behind the IP point. But if that's their position, how can we expect a regulator to even get there as well? And but I would really encourage you all as technologists to demystify, because once we have this, we can also, as individuals, start to understand. We all often say, yes, consent. We have wonderful rights under GDPR. Trying to enforce them, to even understand where your data is flowing. Schrems did a wonderful job, but it's really, really difficult. So that's what I would ask you to do. On the China versus Western point, I mean, to some extent, and really interested in your view, Cory, it's a bit of the difference between a democracy and an authoritarian regime. China is quite happy to use its tech companies as pawns and to assert what they want. But I do think there is a concern that they're seen as their flagship to go out and build up data as well in other parts of the world. And I believe that. I don't think it's just a Western narrative. I think we are busy as Western societies having this debate while China is focused on other parts of the world to our kind of disadvantage. But I'm not an expert in the area.
Could I speak briefly to the China question? Also, you reminded me, I have a book coming out about this from Verso called The Internet Con. I write when I'm anxious, so I have 7 books in production right now. I think they're going to have one for sale after this, my new novel. We've heard that China uses its tech companies as national champions. You have ghouls like Nick Clegg saying if we don't keep Facebook intact, China will take over European cyberspace. So I think that this is not borne out historically or by modern factors. So I'm going to quibble with you slightly here. So historically, in 1980, we reached the culmination of a 67-year project to break up AT&T, the American telecoms giant. And by 1982, it was a fait accompli. And during those 2 years, there was a concerted effort to keep AT&T intact. And it was driven by this rhetoric that across the Pacific Ocean from America was an Asian great power, a military belligerent that stole American ideas and was trying to undercut it in the global markets, that had a history of authoritarianism, and that AT&T was the national champion that would keep America safe from it. That country was Japan. And it turned out that AT&T's major project was making sure nobody got on modem because they wanted to be able to maintain the long distance charges that you now no longer have to pay. And it turned out that AT&T had been basically kneeling on the throat of American tech for 69 years, and breaking up AT&T opened up the space for some of the most important soft power projection of any company since, I think, the age of sailing. So it was, making AT&T smaller was good for American tech, not bad. I think that the Chinese state does not consistently treat its tech giants as national champions. I mean, I think they've thrown too many tech founders in gulags to really say that this is a country that embraces its tech leaders as agents of state power. And the Chinese cyberspace regulation has an interoperability mandate. because they understand that these firms are building these giant silos that make them too big to fail and too big to jail in China too. And if there's one thing that we can say about Xi Jinping is that he guards his power very closely. And the reason he is so down on Chinese big tech is because he understands it as a threat to his power. And finally, I'll say that one of the interesting things coming out of the global foment on antitrust and tech competition is collaboration. So the Digital Markets Unit has been writing incredible reports but not able to enforce on them. But in a heartwarming example of cross-channel collaboration post-Brexit, the European Commission, which has no engineers but tons of enforcement powers, has been using them as roadmaps to go after firms. We have the European Union lacking the power to block the Activision-Microsoft merger, so the Competition and Markets Authority steps in and does it. And so now either Microsoft pulls out of the UK or they don't go forward with the merger. So I think that there's lots of potential for cross-border collaboration here.
Brilliant, thank you. We have 3 questions, which are all by men. So I do invite the audience of any gender to come forward. But the gentleman in the back here has one.
Yes, the great Donella Meadows talked about...
Can you speak up a bit?
The great Donella Meadows talked about leverage points, ways of intervening in large, complex systems, and talked a lot about feedback. Now we know that the tech giants have benefited enormously from positive feedback to get to the size they are. How does feedback get now used against them?
Okay, we collate a few questions. So there was a gentleman down here and here. Is there anyone else who wants? Yes, perfect. Actually, you could technically use my second mic. Alex, do you want to?
There's a third mic on the table.
There? Yeah, perfect.
There we are. You want to use this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you explain how the end-to-end enablement between users will also enable people to be private, like your cancer group?
There's a woman in the back here. Igor, one more. And then we ask, and then it will be your turn.
Hi. I was wondering, how should we think about this interaction between social networks and news? How, social networks, why can they decide what's misinformation and what's not? And can we still talk about being in a democracy when social networks are actually deciding what's misinformation, what's not, who can talk on some platform, who cannot? So I'm a journalist myself, so I'm quite interested into this.
Okay.
Thanks.
Perhaps you do take that gentleman in the back, and then we look for answers.
Okay. We've talked a lot about, or you've talked a lot about the dynamics of the internet or technology and so on, allowing for time to be one key aspect that allows for dominance, twiddling, etc. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the global or geographic aspects. You've touched on it a bit, but how do you regulate something that is transborder, supranational? And related to that is encryption and this desire to regulate on the encryption side, which has obviously issues on privacy and so on.
Okay. Any takers from the audience? Not from the audience, from the panel.
Just on the question of feedback loops, I think that is a really important question, and I think a lot of the growth of platforms has been because they've been able to enable feedback loops which people can't break out of. I think something really important to think about is the idea of things like interoperability are about a shift of power to the user, and the user being empowered then to choose what they do, and that then behooves the tech creators to make feedback loops which work even when the user is freely choosing. And I think, I can't say what that right feedback loop is, but I think if we can create that power shift so that people do have the right to make their own decisions, and that's real, then the innovation around the feedback loops can happen. And tech firms indeed can grow very successful businesses only if those positive reinforcements are in favour of the people being used by the technology. So I think we leave that open, but we try and make that power shift happen, and then the rest can follow from there.
On the kind of like global regulation.
Go closer to the mic. People have asked to.
Sorry, right. I might just hold it if that's okay. On the kind of global regulation point, there's a point made by Cory earlier about the CMA working with the European Commission and the FCA working with the CMA, etc. I think one of the things, particularly in competition regulation, which will be really important, is those kind of informal and formal networks and the kind of coming together of ideas around what the kind of the solutions are. And you'll probably find that regulators in one country find a solution that's then basically copied or rolled out across lots of other ones. So there'll be kind of global networks that need to be come up with in order to do that kind of regulation. In some places there'll be very domestic stuff, which is done in a very domestic way, but ensuring that kind of international collaboration exists, and also ensuring that, you know, industry and civil society groups can feed into that as they're kind of building up, is sort of part of building that system of ethics, governance and regulation, which we advocate for. On the sort of news and misinformation one, as well as the kind of privacy trade-off, some of these topics are just really, really difficult to deal with. There's a tension between different regulatory regimes, whether it's competition versus privacy, online safety versus privacy, but also versus competition. And we have to find mechanisms, and I don't have the answers for this right now, but we need to find mechanisms and routes to find solutions. So for example, in the UK, we have this body called the DRCF, the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which is quite good at bringing regulators and others together to do sort of like deep dive works into privacy versus, or to encryption versus privacy, or what algorithmic auditing should look like. And it's sort of based around, you know, what the regulation looks like, what technical standards are there, what technical solutions could be come up with. So having these kind of like focus groups, sandboxes, task and finish groups can be quite close to getting us to what a solution might look like. But then you actually need politicians to step in and make a decision. And politicians can be quite bad at that. So getting people to do that a bit more will be, I think, more effective at pushing some of this stuff along.
I've been thinking about the question on is this a conversation mostly for the West? You know, there is a danger of that. And so I was thinking about this example. So in India, for instance, they've set up a data co-op that enables women farmers, in this case, to share data about which crops are more weather resilient than others, to try and basically improve the odds and improve their livelihood, effectively. Now, what's interesting about that is that in India, there's been talk of some form of data governance regulation being introduced. It's not yet seen light of day. But this is a good example of a situation where you could argue this is an example of bottom-up empowerment infrastructure, in my view, which comes before regulatory intervention. Now, you could imagine, you know, in Cory's book, you talk about John Deere's tractors. It's something that stuck with me. And I was thinking, well, if there had been data co-ops like this that were in place before John Deere got its act together and basically preempted this kind of bottom-up organization, we may not be in the trouble we are in today. And so sometimes this is a good example of cases where regulation can come too late and where actually arguably the form of bottom-up empowerment infrastructure that I've just mentioned can be absolutely critical to reaching the ends you want to reach and prevent harms like the John Deere scenario.
I want to speak briefly to the idea of interoperability as a form of the leverage you referenced. So when a platform is well established and it's out there in the world, if it is deprived of the legal right to prevent new people from offering services related to that platform, components, consumables, software, and so on, then it becomes a cheap source of ready capital and customers for users. I mean, if you think about what Apple did after they released the iWork suite, they launched an ad campaign called Switch, telling Windows users that they could take all of their Office documents, buy a Mac, and find themselves on a new platform. There was a company called Static Controls that started making cartridges for IBM's laser printers, back when IBM had a business unit called Lexmark that made laser printers. Lexmark unsuccessfully sued to try to get them to stop making toner cartridges. Today, Lexmark is a division of Static Controls, the company that started by making cartridges that could go in Lexmark printers. If that margin is your opportunity, the margin that these platforms extract, then there is a huge opportunity for new market entrants to come in and play. I think capitalists hate capitalism, right? I think you know, Jeff Bezos likes the idea of being able to undercut the publishers, but really doesn't like the idea of anyone being able to undercut him. And I think that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, and that If we prevent these firms that entered the market by doing this adversarial, sharp elbow, take no prisoners stuff from preventing new firms from doing unto them as they did unto others. If we ignore the self-serving logic that says that when I did it, it was progress, but when you do it to me, it's piracy, then I think we can actually open up a lot of space. And one specific area where the UK came very close to doing more and may come close to doing more again if we can turn things around, was there was a time when the BBC was a pioneer of open technology and not just a competitor of firms that made highly proprietary systems, but also an exemplar of what's possible. It prevented the foreclosure on our imagination, what can be done. Today, I think we see some very ghastly outcomes, right? The BBC, for example, increasingly abandoning standards to embrace proprietary solutions, thinking now of BBC Sounds as an alternative to an open podcast platform, and really just instead of teaching Britons to think about technology as something that is theirs to grab and use as they want and extend and customize and be in control of, but rather as a thing that they are controlled by, I think it's a huge misstep. The number of people whose start came from a BBC Micro or who were very interested in the open technology that the BBC built in the early days of the web, who today are part of the British technology industry, and the number of people who won't be because the BBC has all but abandoned that approach, I think is something we should be paying more attention to. Unfortunately, if we are going to kill the license fee and fund the BBC by making it a glorified video rental service for Americans, then we're not going to be able to do that. So.
Jesus. Yeah, I guess I'm considered there's so many questions, perhaps like, you know, Cory, perhaps for you to share those for you to consider in the future. Though I want to end up on a more positive note. So there's two great questions that I want to use as a hook to basically ask you for your closing statements, which basically is, you know, if you look into this room as the average user, consumer, partially also people that develop technology, what is the core message each one of you would give people leaving this room to basically twiddle more, to, you know, find civil disobedience or some form of, you know, dismantle these systems, whether it's like lobbying, whatever you think, but what is the one thing that basically allows people, that people can do to perhaps like help with, like, undergo this system that that Cory basically outlined as being in much need of a change? Don't know if anyone wants to start.
Well, I'd start by saying just get together. Yeah, in this country, you all have data rights. Well, you can't do much individually, but collectively, pull them together. You can reverse the direction of consent if there's enough of you. You can do all sorts of amazing things, monitoring data sharing agreements, etc. So get together, it'd be my simple message.
Thank you.
I mean, I think my message, particularly for the technologists in the room, building technology is really, thank you. Bit too quiet. Building technology is really fun and really awesome. So don't feel like you can't do that, but use that as a way to make some new social norms among the tech community. I think making it socially unacceptable to behave in some of these ways you're describing, and socially impressive to build the cool technology and spread it is something fantastic you can do for the world while building tech, which is really fun and interesting.
I would say sort of speak to your politicians. I think there's still a very big gap. But I spend a lot of time talking to politicians about tech. It's really fun and interesting, as you'd imagine. But there's a really big gap, I think, between what the public cares about and thinks about in technology, and that in Parliament, technology and tech policy is still quite a niche interest pursued by a very few number of people in both main political parties. Yet in the public, you see everyone watches millions of reviews on YouTube to pick the best laptop or the best phone, or they spend a lot of time thinking about this sort of stuff. But the gap, or care a lot about privacy rights, respond to surveys, etc. But the gap between that and what's being discussed in Parliament is very small. So I definitely say either annoy your MP and tell them how much you care about tech, or stand for Parliament yourself if that's a route available to you.
Just building on that, there was an adjournment debate on AI by Darren Jones MP a week last Monday. There were 2 other people in the House. So full disclosure, Darren Jones is who I work with, and I trained him as a tech lawyer. So I probably have a little bit of bias there, but it was a great statement that he made, and there was no interest in it, and it may have just been timing, but that's kind of the level of the debate in our kind of within our legislators, unfortunately. It's the final point is just what I made about demystifying the technology and making it accessible to non-technologists, because actually that's the way that we'll build our collective.
So I want to close by saying that the thing that technology does brilliantly, for better and for worse, is allows people to form groups and work together. This is great if you have a view that has historically been disfavored, like maybe Black Lives Matter, and then you can find other people who feel the same way and you can get together. It's also true if you're someone who wants to dress up like it's the Civil War and march through the streets of Charlottesville with a tiki torch, chanting "Jews will not replace us," right? But the amazing and terrifying thing about technology is it lets us form groups to work together. So when you hear this exhortation to work together, it's an important thing to remember, that we are at an unprecedented moment for finding people to work together with. James Boyle, who's a copyright scholar from Scotland who now lives in North Carolina, where he runs the Duke Center for the Public Domain, says that before the term ecology was coined, some people thought that they were cared about owls, and other people thought that they cared about ozone layer, but they didn't know that they cared about the same thing, because there's no obvious connection between the destiny of charismatic nocturnal avians and the gaseous composition of the upper atmosphere. But the term ecology took 1,000 ideas and turned it into a movement. There are people today who are angry about the way that technology, and in particular about monopoly, is affecting their lives for so many different reasons, right? Because their eyeglasses have gone up 1,000% in the last decade, or because the wrestlers they grew up watching on TV in the 80s are now all working for one Trumpist billionaire who bought all the leagues, rolled them up, reclassified them as contractors, took away their medical insurance, and now they're dying of their work-related injuries and begging for pennies so that they can go into hospital on GoFundMe. There are people who are angry about this stuff for lots of different reasons. They don't know they all care about the same issue. We all are affected by different aspects of this fight. Together, we have a lot of power. Atomized, we have less. Understanding that the thing that is depriving people of benefits because the algorithm says no is the same thing that is impoverishing the Uber driver, is the same thing that is allowing Amazon to screw over its suppliers, and is the same thing that stops you from getting your iPhone fixed instead of sending it to become e-waste, is a powerful realization. And when you combine it with the internet, you have the power to take that realization and make it part of a movement. I helped found a group here in the United Kingdom called the Open Rights Group. It campaigns on these issues. Many of you might be subscribers. If you're not, I urge you to consider becoming one. I don't get any money from it. I'm a volunteer advisor. I mean, there's some staffers, but none of us involved in the founding make any money from it. I'm a net contributor, not someone who's ever gotten money from it, but I think it's worth my money and time. I hope you'll consider it too. It is one of the loci of trying to pull all these struggles together. Thank you very much for the chance to talk to you all today.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to hand over to the head of department, Professor Steve Hales, to close the session.
Okay, thanks everyone very much for coming, for a start. I've got some gifts to give to the panel. While I'm doing that, for you, Cory. While I'm doing that, oh, you do that. Okay.
Thank you.
I'd just like to thank Cory again and thank the panel as well. This is one of the major issues of our times, right? Computer science and the impact it's having on society, you know, the depth of that impact is enormous, right? When you take that and you turn it into business, then the way that business functions has an enormous impact on the lives of everybody. And so it behoves us to consider that and to think about how it should play out, how we should educate our students, what we should do in this domain as well. We're not bystanders here, we're participants. So I'd like to thank the panel very much for their time, Cory for his lecture, and for a fascinating time. We're now going to take some pictures, I think, but we'll be moving over the road to the North Cloisters, where there'll be a reception. So if you'll join us there, that would be great. Thanks for coming, everyone.